Tennessee This Week from WATE 6 on your side starts now.
Hello and welcome to Tennessee This Week. I'm Don Hudson. We are coming into the final stretch of the midterms with Election Day on Tuesday. Recently, we've seen two local Democrats become the focus of ads from House Republicans.
Gloria Johnson represents her interests over Knoxville's.
One spot goes after State Representative Gloria Johnson, criticizing votes against a human trafficking bill and the truth in sentencing measure.
You learn a lot about someone by who their friends are. Greg Kaplan's friends.
Another ad, also from a House Republican, seeks to link District 18 candidate Greg Kaplan to backers of efforts to defund police and supporters of sex reassignment surgery for minors. Now, Kaplan says he opposes those surgeries, calling the claim made on air and in mailers blatant lies. Wednesday, Knox County Democrats used a space where Planned Parenthood's Knoxville facility once stood as the backdrop for a news conference, calling on Republicans and the Republican Party, in their words, to stop spreading extreme rhetoric that they say appears to be inciting violence. That message coming just after Planned Parenthood revealed the fire which destroyed their office was actually linked to a man accused of shooting out windows at the John Duncan Federal Building as well. Investigators claim in court documents that Mark Reno was behind both. He died while awaiting trial over those windows before prosecutors could charge him with arson. Reno, according to the court documents we've looked at, told an informant that he was at the Capitol on January 6 as well and was part of a group called the Church Militant Resistance. Now, at Tuesday's news conference, Kaplan drew parallels with the days of the Spanish Inquisition, while Representative Johnson hit back at her opponent and other Republicans for skipping out on public forums. She accused Republicans of spreading incendiary rhetoric, without checking facts, arguing that doing so has potential consequences beyond the ballot box in this political climate.
Literally, they're making statements about how we think and what we're going to do. We don't even know what we are going to do about a bill that hasn't been written. And to tell us that they know how we think and what we're going to do, and say that we're mutilating children. They say that I voted to put pornographic material in schools. Outrageous lie. What I did was vote against banning books. There is already a law against pornography in schools. Obviously, we want age-appropriate materials in our schools, and no one has said differently. But with the folks out there who are being radicalized with this extreme right agenda, this is dangerous in today's politics. Call me out on a bill I have with facts about that. Please do. And if you think I'm being silly and not a serious legislator, use a clown emoji on a tweet. That's fine. We're not talking about that. We are talking about using violent rhetoric and making us appear to be criminals, friends with criminals. You know, the reality is, I'm not the one who have friends on the House floor getting indicted. My friends aren't criminals. And so we need to end this obsession with children's genitals that they have and talk about the real things that Tennesseans care about, like kids in DCS custody.
We know this is a pivotal moment. There are very few moments like this when we can be in an election to make sure that extremism does not establish roots here in Knoxville.
Now, we reached out to David Posey, the Republican running against Gloria Johnson, and haven't heard back as of our taping Thursday night. But it's important to be clear that those ads Kaplan and Johnson have been announcing, they're not from opponents in their respective races. The TV spots are labeled as paid for by the House Republican caucus and not authorized by any candidate or any committee. That caucus hasn't spoken publicly about the ads. We spoke with Daniel Herrera, head of Knox County's Republican Party, not about the ads themselves, but rather about the idea of negative campaigning. It's not his first choice, but he notes the impact is real.
You have to kind of give it a delicate balance. I think a candidate should more or less try to put a positive image out, right? But if you look at the history of elections, and I'm not just talking about Tennessee, I'm talking about national, negative ads are pretty prevalent. And if you kind of examine it, you would kind of think that negative ads are the prominent advertisements that you see on TV or social media now. So the data shows that voters pay attention to negative ads. And I think it's because when you have a negative ad, it shows a different light from what a candidate's showing. Especially when you look at someone's positive ads, right? A candidate's always going to talk about their positives. They're going to talk about their best features. And there might be some things they don't want to highlight, and that's where negative ads come in. And it's usually the other candidate or a political action committee or even a party sometimes putting out those negative ads and highlighting the negative of the other candidate. I think it's just the human side of just wanting to know all information, right? I mean, it's not the first time we see negative ads this cycle. When Governor Lee was running his first time, we saw the governor candidates slugging themselves on TV ads. I mean, it's not new. I think it's just now catching some more highlight from the public. If you ask political operatives, and I'm a big believer of this, the personal contact is always going to be the best way to get somebody to turn out to vote. Typically, what you mean by that is knocking at the door, meeting them face to face, shaking their hand, and then giving them a little piece of material or some sort of literature about the candidate.
Now, on the national level, political violence came back into the spotlight due to an attack on Paul Pelosi, husband of U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The conversation about this case was followed really down political fault lines with rumor and speculation and disinformation prompting a lot of finger pointing. Soon after, President Biden was casting the midterm election as a vote on the future of democracy, warning that ballots around the country feature candidates who question or maybe even deny the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election and could, he said, have a say in future votes.
There are candidates running for every level of office in America, for governor, Congress, Attorney General, Secretary of State, who won't commit. They will not commit to accepting the results of elections that they're running in. It's unprecedented. It's unlawful. And it's un-American. As I've said before, you can't love your country only when you win.
House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy responded that the president's words were an example of Democrats deflecting away from voters' concerns on things like crime and inflation. Back here in East Tennessee, we hope you'll spend election night with us as your local election headquarters. But you don't have to wait for hot takes and predictions. Our panel of pundits offer those up next. You're watching Tennessee This Week on WATE 6 on your side. Welcome back to Tennessee This Week. We are now joined by our political pundits, Courtney Piper, Craig Griffith, and George Cordes joining us right now to talk all things politics. But what I want to do is focus, if we can, on local elections and the ads that you have seen, and if they are making their points, and if Republicans are taking a strategy of really pointing out contrast. There's a lot there when we talk about the local elections, from the ads that you see, from what people are saying when they're out and about. I want to get your take on that. Whoever wants to jump in can.
Well, with respect to the ad on the Kaplan ad, I read his objections, and I watched the ad several times and read his objections. The ad doesn't actually accuse him personally of being for those positions. It says his friends are for those positions, which then you can sort of draw the conclusion, but it doesn't specifically say that. And on the issue of girls' sports, he didn't address that at all in his response. So that means it's true, since he thinks, according to the ad anyway, that you're a bully if you say that transgender shouldn't, if you don't want to protect girls' sports, or if you want to protect girls' sports. My apologies. And so it's a fairly typical negative attack ad. Right. On the face of it, it's not untrue, because it doesn't say he holds those positions. It says his friends hold those positions. And in his response, I think he made a typical mistake. And that is, my belief is, when somebody has charged you with something and you're responding to the charge, don't repeat the charge. Don't say, they say I believe this and I'm against this and I'm for that. That's not true. Don't repeat the charge, which he does over and over and over again. So on balance, I think that the ad is accomplishing what they set out to accomplish with it.
Yeah. Well, his ads aren't on the ballot. He's on the ballot. But this is typical of political advertising, I think, that's morphed into more negative than trying to identify what you are for, to identify what your opponent is against. I mean, the comical thing about, one of the ads for against Gloria Johnson is that she didn't pass any bills. Gloria Johnson couldn't pass a bill that gave everyone $10,000 in the state of Tennessee. The Republican majority has put her out to farm. So it's not a ethical thing, in my opinion, to say that she didn't pass any bills, because she couldn't pass a bill if she tried.
Courtney.
I do want to point out that there's a big difference between a contrast ad and a negative ad. So a contrast ad is saying, my opponent voted this way and believes this, and I believe these other things. There is absolutely nothing wrong or shameful about holding somebody accountable for their positions or their votes. Negative ads sensationalize those issues, and they walk right up to the line of lying, stretching the truth, and just being outright vicious. And that's what we are seeing, especially in the Greg Kaplan ad, that we saw the Knoxville Jewish Alliance respond to it and say that it was, one of them was rather anti-Semitic because they completely distorted his features. These negative ads, they are increasingly effective because they tap into people's fears. And that's why they are being done. It is sickening and it is disgusting. Those things are not the same as contrast ads and ads that hold people accountable to their positions and their votes.
Yeah, I heard someone today being interviewed that is running for office saying, whatever you think you're prepared for, you didn't prepare for it. Because when you start running, people say all kinds of things about you. And just so everyone understands, the ads ran and then several people came out at the same time and wanted to kind of refute or say their opinion about some of those ads. Let's move on to this. We've been hearing a narrative of political violence more and more, really, the last month or so, and it's really heated up here in the last few days. I'm getting your take on some politicians out there talking about political violence. And it seems that, depending on who's doing the talking, they only, of course, talk about the other guy's political violence and don't bring it all into view.
Well, then you're correct, Don. I mean, for example, not too long ago, when the illegal, according to the law, demonstrations were taking place outside Supreme Court justices' homes, there was a man found with a gun who had come there initially with the intention of killing Justice Brett Kavanaugh. You didn't see weeks of discussion in the media on every channel or in all the editorial pages saying, what are we doing with our rhetoric here? When Maxine Waters said not only should Trump staff members be harassed out of stores and restaurants, when she was called on it, she said, I threaten Trump supporters all the time. Charles Schumer, who leads the Democrats in the Senate, stood on the steps of the Supreme Court and said, threaten, in effect, and he got called on it by USA Today and a lot of other media, and he retracted it, but he still did it when he, in effect, threatened Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, saying if they voted in ways he didn't like, here's what he said: you won't know what hit you if you go forward with these awful decisions. You have released the whirlwind. And these things are, look, Barack Obama, when he was president, and I quote, if they bring a knife to the fight, we bring a gun. If a Republican said that, there would be weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth for days or weeks. So
Republicans have said it.
Here's the deal. Neither side should talk about violence toward the other side. And if a Democrat does it, they should be subject to the same kind of attacks and criticism and condemnation as is so readily visited on Republicans. This is not a one-way street.
Right. It's like
here's the problem with how we're positioning this. The issues and the points that George brought up do nothing but deflect from the extraordinarily serious situation that we are facing right now as a democracy. On January 6th, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of people that pled guilty and said that they came to that riot. They went to the Capitol January 6th because President Trump told them to do so, and they did so at his urging. Police officers died, people got hurt.
Well, just so we
And
know,
that's a very, very,
we,
very
Courtney,
serious issue.
Just so we make sure, a police officer, a protester was shot and killed. A police officer died later after it was over.
Correct. And he died as a result of the injuries at the riot. He didn't just randomly die.
So Courtney, excuse me, what is your point here? That Republicans are always wrong and Democrats are always right?
No, my point is that Republicans are not taking this seriously, and they are not holding people in their own party accountable for their actions.
Oh, well,
let me finish.
All right.
They continue to fuel the fire with conspiracy theories, propaganda, and targeting people's fears. And that's why we saw the person that came into the Pelosi's home and threatened he wanted Nancy Pelosi dead. He wanted to harm her, and he harmed her husband.
Why weren't we discussing this? And we didn't discuss this in this way.
Are you trying to say that the issues that we're facing now are not serious?
When a man showed up at a baseball game and shot 7 Republican congressmen,
George,
we didn't talk about this in the same way.
We talked about it ad nauseum, and the reason why it didn't persist is because people said that was wrong and it shouldn't be done, and they held each other accountable for the action.
Neither side should talk about this. And with respect, Courtney, to your example that Republicans aren't denouncing the January 6th rioters enough, and before you say anything, I was on this channel denouncing that rally. But here's the deal: if you're gonna condemn that, and you're gonna hold all Republicans and all conservatives,
she didn't know. She said some. She said.
Well, then some Democrats are accountable for not speaking up.
Right.
When city after city in America was burning, people were dying, and riots were taking place. Because a lot of my friends on the left were saying,
"What are you talking about, George? Which riots? If you're talking about the ones that were in response to police brutality, those were not democratic protests. Those were community protests."
Frequently called on to condemn them, and quite frequently would not.
George, Democrats did not take to their supporters and say, "Burn down the cities." Okay, that is you are conflating two issues to try and deflect the fact that these are very serious acts of political violence that we're facing in this country right now.
Did Trump say, go into the Capitol, break in, and force them to do what I want them to do? Did he say that?
His supporters think that he said it.
Think is not saying
under oath.
Right. Real
Thinking
quick.
it is not saying it.
They received coded messages from the president that said exactly that.
Well, I'll take a breath real quick. Craig, do you dare weigh in on this?
Read what they said.
Yeah, I know. Craig,
the political rhetoric is way elevated on both sides of the aisle, and it needs to come down. This is the most important election in the history of the country. You know, we have to win, otherwise the country is going to go to socialism. Right. We have to win, otherwise the country is going to be governed by white supremacists. Right. This needs to stop. It's terrible, and both sides need to bring it down. And there are, political operatives that encourage this type of discussion because they think it's the way to power.
Right. So what we're going to do, take a breath, take a break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but just a little bit different angle on that. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Tennessee This Week. We're still talking politics with our panel of pundits. We want to move on. We're going to look at local, state, and national, wherever you want to weigh in on it. A couple days from now, people will actually vote. You already have a lot of early voting in the can, so to speak. Where do you see this election going? Let's start nationally. The Senate, Congress, the House.
Well, historically speaking, the House will change hands.
Right.
The power out of power usually gains. Well, it can gain anywhere up to 40 seats. The projections I've seen this year are more in the 20s, but that would give the Republicans control of the House. The Senate, to me, is kind of iffy. We'll have to see how these elections, and we might not even know on election day, because in Georgia it may have to go to a runoff if no one gets a clear majority. So it would go on for weeks. And locally in the state of Tennessee, state of Tennessee is as Republican as you can get. I don't see any changes going on in the vote. The only interesting thing in two races in the 18th district here in Knoxville, the Elaine Davis, Greg Kaplan race, I still tend to think the Republicans will win that, but we'll have to see if a new person to politics can take her on. And the election in Nashville for the 5th district, the chopped up, gerrymandered old Cooper district that now has 3 seats that incorporate Nashville and more rural areas around Nashville in an attempt to have not a Democratic representative from that area. So that's my predictions.
Courtney?
I agree with Craig. It's very typical that the House changes hands. So all the major pollsters are saying that it will go that way, the House of Representatives. I think it's very likely that Democrats retain control of the Senate, but there are a lot of very, very close state races. Locally here in Knoxville, we have seen, especially with the previous governor's races, how vile, negative campaign ads can negatively affect who you think is the front runner. So we'll see if this recent wave of television ads against Greg Kaplan actually has the opposite effect that was intended. It's a very competitive race and a very competitive district for Democrats. Gloria Johnson is another one. She has a newly created district because Republicans were so afraid of her. They gave her her own district. Nobody wanted to run against her. And that one's going to be another really close one. Every single Democrat in that district needs to go out to vote to make sure that she wins. Nobody can sit on the couch. Nobody can sit on the sidelines.
Well, here's what I think is going to happen from the standpoint of polls. We keep hearing about the polls. The last few election cycles have all kind of been the same story. The polls say this, the polls say this, the polls say this, and then afterwards, how come the polls were so wrong? How did they miss it by that much? So here's all we can do is kind of read the tea leaves here, because we're not privy to the internal campaign polling data that the candidates have. But Chris Celica, who is the political editor, I think that's his title, for CNN, wrote a column yesterday that said the bottom is dropping out of the 2022 elections for Democrats. Now, he's somebody that should know. He's the kind of person that somebody calls up and say, listen, you didn't hear this from me, who wants to stay on good terms with Chris, and says, but here's what's happening in these races. And I heard Newt Gingrich talking about he thinks Republicans could pick up 40 seats. He's another one that people will tell, here is the background, Newt. And I think he's being conservative. I think he's trying to be conservative on what he thinks he knows based on what he's been told. So it could be anything from a nail biter in the Senate and 20-25 seats for Republicans in the House to a real true red wave, in which case we'll all be talking next week about how come the polls were so wrong. If it's the economy, stupid, which is what James Carville came up in 1992 to help to elect Bill Clinton, then Democrats don't have a snowball's chance in this race. None. Not with inflation, not with interest rates going up, not with gas prices. They're in a terrible position. If they hang on to the Senate, it'll be a miracle.
Yeah. All right. Well,
I don't think we should, the polls 8 weeks ago, we were talking about a Democratic wave. And now we're talking about a Republican wave.
We weren't talking about Democratic wave. It looked like Democrat.
Yeah,
what we were hearing was because Democrats passed big spending bills that they'd had some victories. But now it's gone back to where things were about 4 or 5 months ago.
Getting back to what you
said. And why should we believe those polls, I guess? Right. We didn't believe them 6 or 8 weeks ago. Why
getting back to that, will the polls be wrong or will they be right?
There's only one poll that matters.
Right.
There's only one poll that matters.
Right. Beyond that, I want to thank all three of you for joining us once again, for sharing your opinions and your feelings about all these things. And we want to thank everyone at home for watching Tennessee This Week, and we'll see you next week.
The views of guests on Tennessee This Week are their own and do not represent the views of WATE 6 on your side or Nexstar Broadcasting.